Hey everybody, how you doing? Oh, so much better than week one. Nice, we have come a long way. I cannot believe that we are here at the very last class of the semester, but we are. And we couldn't be ending it with a bigger series of guests and a better conversation to be having today about the world that you are entering ahead. And you've heard from a whole slew of speakers this semester about their individual stories and their journeys about entrepreneurship and what they've done as founders and venture capitalists and innovators. And today, we have the pleasure of hearing from three people who have some amazingly unique perspectives to help build upon that. So, as you might recall, the last class we had together before the Thanksgiving break, we heard from Don Winter, the former Secretary of the Navy, talking about technological disruption and perseverance and creating opportunity. Today, we are going to go back and build upon a conversation that you got to have. I was unfortunately not able to partake in and missed when Richard was here almost a month ago, talking about the potential window for what might be a transformation in our economy. So, without further ado, I would like to have our esteemed guests today introduce themselves, because they can do a far better job than I can. And if you wouldn't mind, Madam Dean, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Sharon Matusik. I'm the Dean of the Ross School of Business.
Richard Louie, anchor over at MSNBC and NBC News.
Ron Busby, I'm the President and CEO of the U.S. Black Chambers, Inc. in Washington, D.C.
How about that? That's pretty good. Pretty happy to have you here. Thank you for coming out. Appreciate that. Okay, well, before we dive into things, I'm going to ask Richard to give us a little bit of a recap, if you can, on the notions of the window that we might be hitting here. So I pulled up a couple slides from your deck. If you don't mind kind of speaking and giving this 2-minute wrap-up and recap of what that
Maybe
is.
even 60 seconds.
Yeah, do it.
You know, for those of you that are at the last class, the very idea that, you know, as I was going through covering the COVID the last 3 or 4 years, and I had a lot of time to sit at 30 Rock and wonder and think and look out the window. I heard a lot of sirens for those of you who are in New York City. And when you hear sirens every 15 minutes, whether you're at home or whether you're at work, and you look out the window and where there were millions of people and there are no people, you really start to wonder why and what. And one of those whys and whats was, this is horrific for the world. And as I noted earlier, that's 2 billion workers sitting at home. That is 4.5 billion people required to be home. And what did that mean to us as actors in business? And when I look back in history, I saw that after great cataclysms came great change in our economies. And the most recent one was the end of the Cold War, and then we had 3.0, something we take for granted. We had the digital economy blow up. And that's because, well, all of our great brains that were building killing machines stopped building killing machines, and they started building other things. And so as we fast forward to this cataclysm globally, is there an opening? And that opening could be the idea of a golden rule capitalist society in all parts of the world, because all of our businesses had to do that over the last 3 years. They shifted. They started thinking about us as employees in ways they had never done before. They created services and products from your corner restaurant to the Fortune 500.
Thank you for that. And so upon doing that, they have now created a circumstance where there might be an era where the market favors a potentially selfless economy and what that might look like. Some of the hallmarks that you touched on when you were here last time about what a selfless economy or golden capitalism might look like, kind of took the liberty of listing up here today so we can kind of reference. And so I want to kind of ask our panelists here, from your perspectives, is this the unique situation that Richard is identifying? Is there a window here where there's an opportunity to transform the way that we do business, unlike anything that we've had in recent memory? Or do you completely disagree?
During COVID, between the months of February and April of 2020, the black business economy lost 41% of all of our businesses. that equates to 442,000 black-owned businesses closed their doors. Now, the good news is that as a community, we're a very resilient group of business owners. And so 10% of them opened up at least one time. About 33% opened up a second time, and then another 18% opened up a third time. So as we look at the economy today, we're about 78% of the businesses that closed are now reopened. There were some things that came about that we learned, and as we talk about what the future of the business community looks like from a black business perspective, many of the businesses that did not have a social media presence, we couldn't find them on the internet, we couldn't find them on Facebook, those were the businesses that had the biggest challenges. They just didn't have the visibility. And so many of the small businesses that are black owned understood now that technology was going to have to be their friend. Many of the corner stores that we own and operate, many of the restaurants did not have that social media presence. And so much of the investment in those small businesses are now about making sure that you can be found. The second thing that we found in our community was that if it was a black business or a black product versus a white product, if you remember, during COVID was right after the murder of George Floyd, and so the black business community as well as American consumers were saying, how can we support the black community? And so many consumers were looking specifically for black-owned businesses, and they couldn't really determine because historically, black-owned businesses have been categorized as minority businesses. But we say we're not minority businesses, we're black-owned businesses. And so when you were looking for black-owned businesses, you were trying to go through a directory of Asian-owned businesses and Hispanic-owned businesses, and particularly women-owned businesses. And so our businesses, for the first time, decided we've got to make sure that we are being intentional about who we are, about being certified, as well as being found. And so the future of black-owned business is about being intentional, about being transparent, and most importantly, about holding our own communities as well as corporate America accountable to make sure that our businesses are being supported.
Super helpful, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just amplifying some of the themes that are up here. Other things that were happening at around that same time is, as we've alluded to, the labor market is super tight. So people like all of you here want to work for organizations that represent the kinds of values that you hold. And because it's a tight labor market, that really matters. And so companies are thinking more about, not just the technical skills that they need for jobs, but how do they communicate what they stand for and what's important. And boy, that's a uncomfortable place for many business executives. If you go back in time, 5 or 10 years, the dominant view of most corporate executives is like, you don't want to talk about social issues, you don't want to go there, how can you, stay out of the fray? But now, more and more, people like you, when you're looking at career opportunities, want to know what a company stands for. So that's a whole different dynamic than we had 5 or 10 years ago. And that pressure around being thoughtful about ESG, environmental, social, and governance, this is at a whole new level now. If you look at, not just things that you might select on when you're picking where you want to work, but also corporate boards, this is top of their agenda. And there's not a lot of guidance, so there's a lot of, boy, we need to be mindful of this, we need to think about this, how are we going to respond to it? And so there's a time to really, as a business school, we want to help shape that. We have an executive education program for corporate directors about these sorts of issues. But there's definitely a moment in time where employers are being more thoughtful, companies are being more thoughtful about who they transact with in business. And there's an awareness that these issues related to ESG have to be addressed, and an understanding that maybe we don't have all the answers, and so we need to collectively think about how do we move forward in some of these spaces.
Absolutely. So I'm hearing consumer demand. I'm hearing workforce incoming, the demands, the expectations they have of the businesses that they run. What onus and responsibility is on the current leadership within those businesses? Let me rephrase that. It's not the onus that's on them. How can they continue to propel forward the opportunity to take advantage of this window we have where there was a great amount of empathy extended throughout our society from COVID?
I think right now, from our community, affirmative action is a big conversation, or the attack on affirmative action. You guys are all students, so you know most of you have heard about what had happened on the university side, where now it's illegal or it's being looked upon negatively in reference to affirmative action to enroll students and to accept students from a minority standpoint. Well, the same thing is now happening in corporate America, where now it is being attacked in reference to having affirmative action programs for corporate America. But on the flip side of that, we could either look at it from a negative standpoint, or we can call out corporations that are doing it correctly, doing it positively, and we can make sure that we're supporting those firms, those organizations. It is a very tempered condition right now across the country as we look at affirmative action, as we look at minority programs. And I think it is a difficult time for corporate America, but those firms that are doing it aggressively and proactively, those are the firms that consumers are now saying those are the businesses that we want to support, those are the products that we want to support, versus those companies that are saying, hey, we're going to walk away or we're going to stand still on affirmative action. We're also looking at those organizations to say, okay, are they just talking a good game, or do they really understand and appreciate the minority consumers that have historically been buying and supporting their businesses and products?
Absolutely. As we're talking about minority businesses and products, you and I had a conversation where you talked about the notion of what it meant to actually have a minority-owned business or minority-ran business, and the intertwining nature of how that works with venture capital. To a group of students who are interested in becoming startup founders, working at a startup, or being VCs themselves, explain a little bit about what that nuance is and how that has an impact on what it means to be a minority-owned business or a black-owned business.
The fastest segment of new growth of business owners are black women, and we hear about that and we applaud their effort. Many black women were let go, laid off during COVID, and so they were forced to now go open up businesses of their own. And many small businesses, particularly black-owned businesses, are saying, hey, we want to grow, and so they have to go outside to look for venture capital. If you ask any small business owner their number one concern, they will say access to capital. But when you talk to a black business owner, they would say their number 1, 2, and 3 concerns are affordability, availability, and accessibility. So many firms are obviously looking for venture capital. Many of you will go into business for yourself and look for venture capital. The challenge is that black-owned businesses get less than 1% of all venture capital that's available. So when we do find venture capital, we're very excited about it. But what happens in many cases is if you take too much of the capital, now you lose your 51% ownership. To be considered a minority firm, particularly a black-owned firm, you have to own 51% of your company. So many of the big names that you see out here don't have their minority status anymore because they had to go get venture capital from majority firms. And so the programs that have been created to help minority firms, to help small businesses, are now not available to them. When I talk to corporate America, they say, well, Ron, we do more business with black-owned firms if we could find them and if they had the size and scale. And so the U.S. Black Chamber is really pushing mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, and consortiums. But it is a challenge when we look at venture capital because you lose so much of the equity in your firm when you do take on the venture capital. And in reference to being able to find us, and that happens across the country. I'm looking for a black firm in Ann Arbor that prints. Okay, well, let me go look in some directory across the neighborhood, across the state, across the country to see if I can find one. Those have always been difficult. In the early years of business, there was a thing called the Green Book, if you can remember. It was publications that black people used to use when they were traveling across country because there were only so many places that we could go and still get service. And so we'd make sure that we had the Green Books with us as we traveled. It also was available for corporate America as well as black consumers to make sure that they can find other black-owned businesses. Today, technology is available so you can find black-owned businesses through an app called byblack.us, byblack.us. It allows you to find businesses that are black-owned, that are 51% owned or more across the country so that you can support black-owned businesses.
Thank you for that. Dean, if you could talk to, well, feel free to address any part of that you'd
Well,
like.
you know, I think this is such an interesting conversation. I mean, a couple of things that I would say is, you know, and this is, you know, putting on my professor hat, you know, and thinking about all the entrepreneurship students in the audience. Venture capital and access to venture capital is very important. And I will say that there's many ways to finance ventures, including debt financing, which oftentimes can be better because you don't have that same loss of ownership and control that you have when someone is making an equity investment. And also, if you think about different forms of financing, boy, venture capitalists like certain kinds of businesses, tech forward, the ability to scale up. They're looking for certain multiples on the kinds of exits that they might get eventually, and that doesn't fit all kinds of businesses. So, you know, I think that we can all do a better job of making sure that entrepreneurs who are trying to scale up their ventures have a good understanding of the wide range of different ways that they can do that and grow in a way that meets all their needs. You know, part of it is, you know, with venture capital, you get certain kinds of network access and things like that. But there's other ways to get that as well that might be more favorable to the entrepreneur. And then, you know, I would also say there's some firms out there that are doing an amazing job, you know, venture capital firms out there, like trying to have a charter that invests in different kinds of enterprises. At the Ross School, a couple of weeks ago, we had an event called Women Who Fund, and it was bringing together women venture capitalists who are investing in women-owned firms. And yeah, support them. You know, like they're doing amazing work. You know, so I do think that there's a community of people out there who are trying to cast a wider net and invent new models and ways of taking on this industry in a different way.
And that's awesome. And you know, part of what I've been doing is research for the last 2 years into business and workers of color. And when we add in all of this intersectionality, specifically funding women-owned businesses or black-owned businesses, is to think also of all those different intersections in the space. Women of color, for instance, in business are the most disadvantaged of any group at work. So when we start, unfortunately, and I'm not good at math, and I was talking with our esteemed guests a little bit earlier about not being so good at it, but when you put together women plus of color, it equals 3. 1 + 1 = 3. And it's not a positive 3, it's a negative 3. And I can talk about the data forever around that. That's very consistent. The manifestation of, I think, 4.0 and this idea of golden rule capitalism is what you can do intentionally in your business creation. Who are you working with? Who is in your small group? Who? Do they all look like you? When I've been working on startups the last 15, 20 years, and the last one I remember, I was just looking across at our group and I was like, we all look the same here. So my last business, which I just started 7, 8 years ago, very small, you know, our turnover is very, very small, but still, you know, relevant, high 6 figures, but we're trying to do something different. And I'm very intentional and not always successful at looking across and going, are we all the same here? Do we have the same ideas? Because I'm not saying only looking the same, but the way you do things here at Michigan is different. Around this country and around the world, when you put your resume out, whether it's a funder or a potential job, they go, University of Michigan. Oh, you get stuff done, don't you? So the choices that you make about the way you get stuff done, I know that in Silicon Valley, the idea is just get it done any way you can. No, my friends, the decisions you make can be looking at the other. And that's the suggestion, that we've lived through this time now. Don't put it in a shelf and say, I'm going to think about the other when I'm done making my million. I clearly have an opinion. We talked about in the last session. I do believe every choice counts. Winning is not at all costs. And I think if we can think about the other as was said here, whether it is black-owned businesses, whether it's a black partner, whether it's part of your team, whether it's women-owned businesses, whether it's a woman of color, whatever the idea is, every decision does count in the businesses that you're creating. And you may go, oh, well, I can't find the right talent, I can't find the right partner. Then you should look harder, because it's out there. And the things structurally in our society sometimes, and I get asked this a lot, whether it's in business, whether it's in media, I get asked that a lot. It is out there. Let's just make the right choices intentionally.
Well, Richard clearly peeked at my slides, and he saw the next one coming, because I was going to talk about Doug's song, saying just that, Ann Arbor's local founder guru, and he was recently asked about advice he would give to founders who want to make a positive impact in their community and also run a successful business. And the crux of what he said was this notion that ultimately the diversity of opinions and of perspectives being had there isn't just something that should be had on a moral basis or because the society needs it, but ultimately because there's real value in actually having that type of conversation and that kind of debate. As students here are thinking about being founders, how can they bake that in from day one? Sure, every decision that they make along the way, but when they're doing formation of a company, when they're looking at actually putting a patent on a product, when they're looking at founding with somebody else that they're going to pick from, their initial hires, what checklist of questions should they be thinking of and going down?
I might just jump in and talk a little bit more about some of the points that Richard raised. I was at a get-together of tech startup founders in Boulder, Colorado, which is where I lived before coming to Ann Arbor. And it was a round table with, some of the luminaries in Boulder, like the Brad Felds and the Dave Cohens, who started Techstars, and some of these really impactful technology accelerators. And it was a gathering to talk about how do we get more diversity into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And you look around the room, everyone was a white guy for the most part. And, so you've got this room full of white guys saying like, oh, how can we make our environment more welcoming to different kinds of people? And one of the realizations that came out of that discussion is, as a founder, as an early stage entrepreneur, you are so busy. If you have the luck of growing your company, like everything's happening so fast, and what do? You reach out to people in your network, someone that you trust and because you gotta make it happen, you gotta move forward. And so we know that our networks tend to look like us, so then you wake up, you've got 500 employees and they all look like you. So I tell that story to reinforce the point that boy, those early stage decisions make a huge impact. One of the things that you can do right now is build a network right now while you're here at Michigan of all kinds of different people, so that when you go out and you're starting this venture, it's growing gangbusters, you need to pull people in. Just that act of bringing in different kinds of people early, people's network look like them, so bring in different people right away. And that way you're not going to wake up when you're at scale and suddenly everyone is the same kind of person because you were just trying to get it done.
Sow the seeds early.
Yeah.
Sow the seeds.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of a conversation we were having yesterday about embracing uncomfortable conversations and embracing opportunities to put yourself in a position to where you are going to be forced to think and behave and react to conversations that you otherwise would never naturally come into. Is that something that's benefited you throughout your career, and give us a story of when that's happened for you?
Well, for me, I came to Washington, D.C. As a nomad. Nobody knew me, wasn't like I was an elected official.
Can you give us the backstory and how you can, because that's a good story they need to hear.
I was living in Phoenix, Arizona. Had just moved there. My wife had just died. I had two young sons, 5 and 6 years old. And I had my second business. And I want to say a couple of things. I know I got a 28-year-old son and graduated from Columbia and wanted to go into tech. I came out of college and I was in tech. And he always wants to find that next mousetrap. And most of you guys in here all want to be these startup companies. And I want the latest technology. And I left IBM, and Richard and I had this conversation early on. And I was in Oakland, California, and I took over a family business. And our family business was janitorial. So we were cleaning buildings. And I had left, had invested a lot of money in college education and graduate school, had worked in technology. But we had this family business, and it was very small. I say we had 5 employees, my mother, my father, my 2 sisters, and me. The company was doing about $150,000 in annualized revenue. I was making about $150,000 a year before I left my company. So I moved back into the same bunk bed that I had when I was in the 3rd grade, and all of my classmates thought I was crazy for taking this huge risk to move back home to take over this labor-intense business. But I had a vision of how we were going to get there. And I say that because I think people, young people particularly, get caught up in the industry versus getting caught up in the opportunity. There aren't going to be that many more new mousetraps that are going to be created, but there are great industries that are happening every day that many young people just walk by because it's not sexy, because it's not the latest thing that you see on TV or you're reading about in your industries. But I started a janitorial business and grew it to from $150,000 a year to where we were doing $15 million. It didn't sound like a lot of money at $15 million, but we were operating on about 35 to 40% profit. Profit on a $15 million firm is a lot of money to a young person. Ended up selling the business, and I was in Silicon Valley, right down the street from Oakland was San Jose. Before it was Silicon Valley, it was just San Jose. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't high tech. San Jose was the...
Sorry, San Jose. You're out there.
San Jose was a rough neighborhood. But I couldn't even get an interview to empty the trash at IBM. It was very tough to get into the market. But I understood that if I could find a firm that was doing the work, that I could acquire that firm. So we ended up acquiring a firm. We doubled our size. Ended up selling the firm. I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and so I'll get to the story. Arizona was the last state to acknowledge Dr. King holiday. In the 90s, we still were not acknowledging that Dr. King was an important figure in this American economy and history, and so we didn't have Dr. King holiday. And I came to Arizona thinking that this is crazy. We've got to do something about this. And so I was able to use the leverage. I was running the local black chamber there. If you remember, and politically, we had a Democratic governor, Governor Janet Napolitano. She was the first governor to endorse and come out and back Senator Barack Obama. He was a no-name at the time. If you also remember, we had John McCain, who was a Republican senator in Arizona. Well-known, well-liked. I cleaned his building. His wife had a Budweiser distributorship, one of the largest in the country. We, Phoenix, had a professional football team that was playing at a college stadium, outdoors, 120 degrees, and you got uniforms on, and you got fans sitting outside on metal benches. The state said we were going to move and get a new stadium. We said, no, you're not. We were able to use the leverage that we had politically made a relationship with the black NFL players and said, hey, if you guys will back my play, I would appreciate it. Just say you're going to boycott until Arizona takes on Dr. King holiday. I was able to negotiate a deal to get the Cardinal Stadium built. John McCain's wife got the Budweiser distributorship. I got the janitorial service at the and we got Dr. King holiday. I had met then a guy by the name of Barack Obama, but this was before he was President Obama.
Before he stopped smoking, too.
Yeah, so I love to play golf. He likes to play golf. Our governor said, hey, there's this guy. He loves to play golf. You should take him out. We go out. He's smoking cigarettes, and he's stuttering and hitting the ball everywhere. And I was like, what are you trying to do? He said, well, I want to run for president. I said, president of what? Like, your middle name is Hussein. We just had 9/11. Nobody's going to vote for you, man. But I said, but if you decide, we will back your play. We ended up renting a bus. We did a bus tour throughout the state of Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. And he came back to us and said, we're going to win, but I don't want you to embarrass John McCain, so take your foot off the gas, we're going to be okay. And I was like, what are you talking about? You're not going to win, you know? He ended up winning. We ended up getting the Cardinal Stadium. We ended up getting Dr. King Holiday, and he said, well, man, if you can pull this off in Arizona, you need to move into Washington, D.C. and start the U.S. Black Chamber. It was March of 2009. I did, and now I'm the president of the United States Black Chamber.
National Voice of Black Business right there.
Yeah.
So an uncomfortable conversation to negotiate MLK Holiday Stadium contract led to a win, a selfless win for all, and bettered the whole community in the process. What examples are we talking about? What uncomfortable conversations have you had that have created a win?
I don't know that I have one off the top of my head. That's a tough question. I mean, I feel like we engage in those kinds of, like we were just talking when we were coming in about, some of the current events and things like that. I feel like we, as educators, we're trying to make sure that we are working with everyone in our community to give people the skills to think critically, engage civilly, and use that as a way to be well-informed and make good decisions. So I feel like that actually is part of our mission in terms of things that we're doing here every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and part of that, we were talking about this, so there's a lot of news going on right now. And over since we last were together, unfortunately, I've had to cover something that is very painful for the world. Hours upon hours of a discussion that we don't want to have, but we need to have. And I remember when I first arrived at Berkeley, and I hit Sproul Plaza, the famed place where the peace movement started, if you will. And I stood in that little circle, and Michigan has a similar space, that said, in the ground, here all opinions are accepted, free speech. It's a little circle if you ever make it to Berkeley. And I looked at that, and then I saw everybody arguing with great passion and pain, which you have seen on your campus here too. And this is the place to do that. This is the place to have the uncomfortable conversation. I had so many uncomfortable conversations in the last week. I've covered the story since 2007, where I knew nothing about these topics. But it had to start somewhere. And I think back to that little circle in Sproul Plaza where I was inspired to have the uncomfortable conversation. And the places where you can do that here is join the club where you're going to show up and they're going to go, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And you're going to go, yeah, why am I here? You're in the right place. Because here's that place where you can do that. One of the things I did is I showed up at Men's Chorale. I can't hold a tune. I can't sing. I am horrible. But I showed up. And all these folks were able to sing. And I'm like, what am I doing here? This is at Berkeley. So please don't go back and look at the pictures, because I'm the guy that's sitting there in the back with his mouth completely opposite of everybody else. And for those of you who have taken a class, what you do is you do say watermelon a whole bunch of different times. So there I was in the back just going watermelon, 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 watermelon. And you didn't know. But that's uncomfortable. And I had done it at the time because my interest was speechifying. I was a rhetoric major. So I knew that if I could stretch myself to a point where I was so uncomfortable to be around other people that are not like me. And so find that club here. It could be community consulting at Ross. That's a great place to find conversations and businesses that you would never engage with otherwise. That's what I did when I was here at business schools. I did join community consulting, and it was the way I got to meet our great community here in Detroit and in greater Michigan. That was an uncomfortable space for me. I got to see people and communities and topics that I'd never seen before.
In Washington, D.C., people get elected and they move there. And they move there and they say, this is great, I don't want to go home. It is like the epitome. And so when they get into the room, everybody is saying the same thing because nobody wants to be controversial. I got in the room and I said, well, I'm not an elected official, so I don't have to worry about getting re-voted in. Mm-hmm. I make my own money, so I don't have to worry about getting fired. And so I always said, for the guy that's in the back of the room that never gets the opportunity to ask the question, I'm going to ask that question. I'm going to make that statement. And this is what happened. I'm sitting on a stage like this, and Barack Obama is sitting in the back room. We can't even see him. And he comes out and he says, man, you're a breath of fresh air to Washington, D.C. It was a room with 300 black leaders, and he said, I want to introduce you guys to somebody, Ron Busby, and he says this, the national voice of black business. And I was like, oh, shit, that's perfect. And I wrote that down, and that's our tagline
Keep
today.
that on tape. Keep that one on tape, yeah.
I think sometimes, especially as young people, you've got to be controversial. That's the only way you'll get acknowledged. People that just get along to go along, those are the folk that just...
It's just boring.
They're boring. They
Right,
don't
it's
get
boring.
that opportunity to get invited back. Here we go.
You gonna do it?
I was on a
I
panel
feel
with
like-
this guy right here 7, 8 years
He's sitting
ago.
up straight now.
And he asked a very...
Is that national TV?
He asked a question, and it stumped me, and I didn't have a really good answer, and I just gave the answer that was on my mind. And I was thinking, wow, that was not politically correct. That was 7 years ago, and I thought to myself, I will never get invited back to be with this guy from Intimate. And I get the phone call saying, hey, you were right on point. You're always on point. Will you come back? And I was surprised. You've got to make sure that you're challenging yourself to not just say the things that are politically correct, but the things that need to be heard. Those are the people that get the opportunity to come back, because we've already heard all those other answers, but those answers that are a little bit out of the box, that are a little bit awkward, but need to be stated, that need to be heard, those are the voices that we really want to hear from.
Can I pipe in really quickly? I never want him back on MSNBC or MB. I'm joking, but well thought. And sometimes you think through it and you go, because you're a thinker. You go through it and you go, well, that doesn't sound like, and I've thought about this, and if I say this out loud, it doesn't, so if you've thought about it and it doesn't sound quite right, and I sometimes will ask questions on air that I know might be a little bit different, but I've thought about it, and if it comes to mind, yeah, try it out. Try it out.
And I think, kind of bringing this back to entrepreneurial ideas and ideation, to be able to ask those questions of, well, why is it that way? Or why are we assuming it has to be X, Y, or Z? Those are some of the really fruitful questions when you're thinking about how do you open up an opportunity that's not out there. So part of it is, just how you present in the world, but part of it is also like thinking about what are those opportunities for the future, and how do you identify those in a way that gives you a window onto something that maybe is not the norm and opens up a pathway that might not already be there.
Oh, go ahead.
To the selfless business and that idea of this continuum that we might be on, ask that question. It's an uncomfortable question. And I'm not suggesting that you're going from 0 to 100, nor when we build up this idea of thinking of others, and we talked about many different levels here. It's not like you get there 0 to 100, you get there step by step. And so that idea, I think, is very important. Get there slowly if you need to.
Right. Everything's a spectrum or a continuum in that way. So to that lens...
You don't need to be perfect.
You don't need to be perfect, no. No, you don't need to be perfect. Making intentional decisions each step along the way. To that notion, let's open up that idea of what it means to look into the future, what it means to otherwise have some conversations around how things are going to evolve. What ceases to exist in capitalism as we know it today in 2030 or 2035, 10 years down the road? What ceases to exist, or what is fundamentally different? And maybe it's a hope, or maybe it's what you see happening, coming.
Well, I want to address one of the statements that was made by the dean, and hopefully this will touch on a little bit of that. She talked about women providing capital to women. And so there's an organization in Atlanta, Georgia called the Fearless Fund. It's owned and operated by 3 black women. One of them attended my university, Florida A&M University. And they did exactly that. They raised funds, and they said, we're going to make loans and grants to black women business owners, because that's the women that really needed it, and there's very little out there. Today, they are being sued. They are being sued for discrimination because white men and white women said that they could not apply for those same dollars. And so we've got to start to think, is it good or bad business decisions on a lot of the cases that are being out there? And how are we going to, as capitalists, still make the opportunity available for small and particularly black and brown businesses to be able to get the resources, the financing, and the opportunities that they need? It is not coincidental or accidental that the attacks on many of the minority organizations, minority programs that have been established over the last 60 years are being under attack. We've heard a lot about the infrastructure bill that's actually in place right now, where there's going to be trillions of dollars of contract opportunities actually available in 2024. And so many white business owners are now nervous that they may not be able to participate, and so they're saying, well, we've got to stop some of this growth from other communities, and so they're using some of the same legal cases that minority-owned organizations and businesses established back in the 50s and the 60s to provide those opportunities, to now use that same legal case to say it's discriminatory to make sure that black women have access to the capital that they need. Right now, capitalism is not looked upon favorably in many eyes, but understand that it's still the best operation available. Many folks say, well, the largest opportunity for American businesses is outside of the boundaries, territory of the United States. 98% of the growth for black firms will come outside of American boundaries. But most folk think, well, I'm going to go on the continent of Africa and sell my product. I just left Ghana about 7 weeks ago. The average annualized income in Ghana for a citizen is $5,000 a year. So it's unrealistic to say, I'm going to take a product and sell it in Africa or in Ghana. But what is available and what is a great opportunity is the products that they have on the continent, to be able to take those, bring them back to the United States, and sell them to the consumers that have the funding. I think we've got to look as business owners and potential business owners to say, where can I go to create a valuable product that is low cost, that I can make a high profit margin on? And I think that it's going to come outside of the United States. And so I think many of you guys need to be looking at, how do I import and export to be able to create the value that I need for me, my family, and my business?
So increased globalization, I'll take that as.
Yep.
Okay. Predictions on capitalism?
Well, kind of building on that theme, one of the things that, obviously you've got a biased sample of people here, we're speaking to an entrepreneurship audience. I think entrepreneurship is such a powerful way to help people solve problems in their own contexts in ways that create job in their local environment. So, my comment is maybe more a broad one about, how do we provide avenues for economic inclusion broadly across societies. There was a really interesting book that I always talk about called Why Nations Fail. I don't know if anyone's read this book, but it was written by a historian and economist, and one of the main theses in the book was you need to have inclusive economic institutions as well as inclusive political institutions when you look over, vast periods of history. And some of what I think we're seeing with the conflicts around the globe is that lack of economic inclusion. People don't see a way forward in terms of providing for their families, providing opportunities for themselves long term. And boy, I feel like there's nothing more dangerous than someone who doesn't have anything to lose. And I think entrepreneurship is one of the levers that we have as a society to provide more economic inclusion for a broader cross-section of people. It's kind of this idea of teach the fishermen to fish. So if you help people with those skills to recognize opportunities and act on opportunities, they're going to solve problems that they're facing locally. They're going to create jobs locally. They're going to solve those problems in ways that make sense given the resource base of those different contexts. So, I don't know about capitalism generally. I think that entrepreneurship, is a really important part of that. I don't, to your point, I don't know that there's a better system than capitalism, and I think that eye towards economic inclusion and how we can use the power of things like entrepreneurship to help drive that is a path forward.
Yeah, I want to build on what the dean says, and that idea of the word inclusion is also debated in business greatly. But in my research, guess who Americans look for to make change in society? They trust businesses more than anything else to change society. You're not creating necessarily a business to change society. Maybe you are. And part of that change is this idea of including others. And I think what may change is our idea of what others are. This otherism of being outside what is inside. If you look back in history, the Romans said, we can't take care of everybody, so let's allow businesses to thrive. Let's go to outside our walls to see how we can build better places for all people. And when I was standing in the streets, there's a segue here, in Ferguson, Missouri, that didn't pop in my mind what the Romans did until I did a story on Sam's meat store. And Sam was not the owner. But I walked in and I said, you've now been burnt down twice during, this is after Michael Brown was killed. And I said, why are you staying open? There's these knuckleheads that are coming here and burning down your store, and you're open every day. Why are you open? And Muhammad says, because I'm here for the community. I have customers that show up every day. They get their eggs, they get their meat, they get their chicken, they get their toilet paper here. And I was like, but you don't have barely a quarter of your shelves filled right now. Yes, but I need to take care of my community. All of these people around. He got burnt down the next night, and he still opened up. Does your wife want you to be here? No, she doesn't. Do your employees? Why are they here? They want to be here too. So Muhammad, I think, really articulated that idea, right? Why are we here? Some days it is to take care of our community. Some days it's to make money. So the idea of selfless business, the idea of thinking of others, you don't have to show up every day doing that, but show up when it counts. And that, I think, is what we'll see differently in 2030, is that we'll start to see each other in the way we do businesses, the way we do business, I think in a more mature and nuanced way. You don't have to be superheroes, but I think there'll be more days that businesses does look out and say, yeah, that was what the Romans were thinking, that we are here to do something better, and we can, and we need to bring in others along that journey.
I can't think of a better way to wrap up this semester. Hope for the future. Thank you very much, everybody.